Hello, hello.
Hi, Willie. How are you?
I'm
Good to
back,
see
Ron.
you again.
A week on.
A
The only
week
thing
on,
I do
Willie.
all week, other than
Sorry?
sitting at my desk. This is my one social event of the entire week.
Well, we thank you so much for joining us, Willie, and taking the time to do this at the outset before we have Willie unraveling his magical experiences. I just wanted to say a big, big, big heartfelt thank you to all our viewers. We've been inundated with people coming to writing to Priya, to me, and to Willie, wanting to for this, the history hour to go on, and we're just very thankful to you and
Each time I
deeply,
say to Mia, this will be our last, and
yeah.
each time you come up with a very good idea, and I say, fine, fine, we'll do it
Yeah,
again. We'll do
exactly. And also thank you, Priya and Roli Books. It's been such a pleasure. And thank you, Willie, for taking the time out and doing this. I know you've got so many things going on, the Jaipur
I've absolutely
Festival, your
nothing
book.
going on there. You're the only thing I've got all week.
Well, we're delighted to have you anyways, Willie. Now, I was telling everyone, the viewers, that, you know, travel writing is probably one of the most enriching experiences, at least as far as I was concerned, Willie. It was a very humbling experience. It made me a deeply compassionate person, traveling through different countries, engaging with different cultures. It grounds you. It makes you realize how beautiful this world is, how beautiful, mankind as a people we are. I mean, of course, we have our awful tendencies and terrible nature, but we're by and large beautiful people, and the landscape of this world is magnificent, and that's what travel writing taught me. But without any ado, ladies and gentlemen, I want the master writer to start this session with his fabulous experiences. So, all yours, Willie. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Moin. So I suppose first of all I should just line up these. This is my little pile of travel books from the first half of my career.
It's not a
Where
little
are
pile,
they?
Willie.
There they are. Um, and I mean, this is how I got into writing and what I did really until I had kids. And then, oddly, the kind of urge to go off on long, epic 3 6 month journeys um, around dangerous parts of the world ebbed. When you've got small kids at home, not only did I have a wife who would have probably divorced me if I'd gone off for 6 months, leaving her with babies and nappies to change.
Did you not
Uh,
take them along with you, Willie? Too
well, I
risky.
mean, that's the other option. But again, the kind of places which I
Yeah,
was traveling, like Afghanistan
sure.
and it's exciting and interesting places with major civil wars and
Sure,
insurgencies.
sure. Of
And
course.
a good Norman Lewis always said he never went anywhere to write a travel book unless it had a terrible dictatorship and typhus. I can follow typhus. I can't remember. And I mean, when I started, I suppose partly I was very lucky. I got into a college at Cambridge, Trinity, which in the kind of odd system of Oxbridge colleges, these colleges are self-governing and self-ruling and self-financing. And Trinity had a genius bursar in the 1950s and 60s who invested all the college's money in a new docks at Folkestone, was it? I can't remember. Anyway, the long and short of it was incredibly rich. The
Yeah.
whole of the rest of academia in Britain was going through Thatcher cuts and everything was suffering, while Trinity had this sort of excess of money that it was willing to give to its undergraduates if they could come up with a half decent, remotely scholarly idea. And so quite a lot of my time at college was spent trying to find ways of getting money out of the college to spend
Well done, you.
in different ways myself. And I remember passing the notice board at Trinity one day, and a notice had gone up saying there was something called the Gaillard Lapsley Scholarship for medieval historians. Now, I knew there were only about 5 other medieval historians in the college, so the
Yeah.
chances were that I had a pretty good chance if I put in a half decent proposal
Yeah.
of getting cash to go on my summer holidays. So I duly went off to the college library, got out the Times Times Atlas of World History.
Fabulous.
And
they are fascinating, though, aren't they? Really, atlases. I loved them as a child.
And historical atlas is a double whammy. It's maths plus it's history. So the big Times Atlas of World History I got out, and I looked at what was the longest medieval journey that I could claim the most money for. and so I then copied out the page on Marco Polo, sent it off, forgot about it. And
it's Silk Route.
A month later, came under my door, there's an envelope with a check for £750, which in 1986, you can probably add an extra nought on that, like getting 7,000 quid today.
Yeah.
And this
when was this, Willie? What year are we talking?
1986.
Okay.
And at this point, I should also say that the English travel writing genre had undergone a sort of revival.
Yeah.
It had been very big in the 1930s with writers like Robert Byron and Peter Fleming. Alexander Burns in the 1890s. Well, these sort of cyclical things, 1890s, and then again in the 1930s. And then it went unfashionable for a long time.
But were you in any ways inspired by the likes of Alexander Burns, Willie? You know, did that kind of storytelling inspire you to get out? It was something like that inspired?
To be honest,
I never
heard of Alexander Burns then. I think obviously I've written about him since and read him since. But the stuff I was reading at college was this 1930s travel writing, like Evelyn Waugh, Robert Byron, Peter Fleming, and then the people who had taken it forward recently in the 80s. Bruce Chatwin, who I'd happened to have met and sort of become a disciple of. Patrick Leigh Fermor, who Chapman introduced me to.
He's a genius, absolute master. We went to his home. Leonie and I went to his home, and it's such a stunning place. Patrick Leigh Fermor.
Cardamili.
Cardamili. Exquisite place. Anyway, sorry. Please carry on, Willie.
So I was reading all this stuff, and the combination of the fact that the college had this money to go on these trips, plus these books were not only incredibly appealing, but also fashionable to publishers.
Sure.
It seemed like an obvious thing, rather than joining a merchant bank or becoming an accountant or doing any of the other sort of boring options which were out there.
Very boring.
I thought, try my luck, put in an application, and the check turned up. And then I suddenly found I had to actually go on this frigging trip. I'd really only put in the money on the off chance that, a proposal on the off chance that I'd get some cash. And then it turned up, and I found myself committed to going across Asia from Jerusalem through Syria, Iran, that was then, at war with the West in all sorts of ways, although it was technically possible to get through, up Pakistan, through the Karakoram Highway had opened up that year. So it was the first year you could cross for, I think, since the 1940s, since Mao. It was the first time you could cross into Western China from Pakistan up the Karakoram Highway. And so it's possible.
The majesty of those views and those vistas must be just astonishing, isn't it?
I've never seen anything like the Karakoram Highway.
Oh, I can imagine.
As you go up, you come to the place where the Pamirs and the Himalayas meet. Around Nanga Parbat.
At that point in time, one feels that, what are boundaries and borders?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just utter pleasure. And to be 21, as I was, to have a little bit of prize money in my pocket, and to be free to travel these exquisite, beautiful parts of the world on routes that had only just opened up, that simply, it wouldn't have been possible to have done this journey even 1 year earlier.
Sure.
It was an incredible piece of luck. And at that point also, for example, Pakistan hadn't become the dangerous place it was going to become 10 or 15 years later with the jihadis going nuts in Peshawar and so on. And so, it seems incredibly naive, but at that age, one could just go off. And
of course. And you have adrenaline pumping in you just to explore.
I didn't make a single hotel reservation of any sort. We just set off
Yeah.
not a booking on any. It was one booking to get from, because obviously you can't get out of Israel at that period into any Arab country. I had to get a boat from Israel to Cyprus and another Russian boat from Cyprus to Syria.
So from Israel, you went into the Mediterranean, got to
Correct.
Cyprus, which would probably obviously not have been Turkish Cyprus, but Cyprus, the Greek Cypriot enclave, and from there on,
a Russian boat to get me to Syria, to Latakia.
Russian boat to get you to Syria. Putin.
Long before Putin. This is Brezhnev era. And so no bookings, no clear idea. And the only guide I had was Marco Polo himself. And I borrowed from the Trinity Library a 2-volume scholarly edition done by a man called Sir Henry Yule, also famous in South Asia for editing Hobson Jobson, the dictionary of Indian, Anglo-Indian slang.
Yeah. Well done.
And so set off and took two kind girls accompanied me. One was this formidable woman called Laura, who went on to run Tesco's and Marks and Spencer and become the kind of British businesswoman of the year, who got me through all these things, got the visas organized, got the injections organized. There was incredible, found maps to kind of places. And then was my ex-girlfriend who had just broken up with me for a friend of mine. So there was slightly sort of tense second half of in that. But it went very well. And we had this incredible trip. And out of it came this book, which I published at the age of, I suppose, 21, 22 in Xanadu. I found it. I had no literary links of any sort at that point in my life, but my brother, by pure chance, happened to live next door to a literary agent called Maggie Noah.
Yeah.
And so I literally knocked on her door, gave her a proposal. She gave it to some publishers. And because at that point, again, incredible luck, because at that point, travel writing was very fashionable, managed to find a publisher. And I'm still with him. Mike Fishwick, the publisher who bought my first book when I was 21, is still my editor at the age of what I am now, 54.
Fantastic. What a story. Willie, I want to ask you, obviously, since then, non-fiction history has become your forte in many ways. You've ascended to incredible heights in that space, but tell me a little bit more, and tell us a little bit more about the influence of travel writing on your historical writing, on history writing, and how did that kind of transition happen? As you were traveling, were you just completely mesmerized by what you were seeing, and therefore from that point on you decided to take the plunge into writing history, or how did it all come about?
It's a circular thing, and I'm sure you find the same, Moin, that when you travel, you come across things you don't understand or you didn't know about. And particularly if you're going somewhere interesting with a good guidebook, and you find by the time you come home, you've got this list of things that you're longing to follow up and buy books about and read about, or Google, whatever it is. And then as you begin to read, lists of other places that you want to visit appear. And so reading and traveling are this sort of symbiotic pair of activities. That, the more you do one, the more you want the other.
Sure.
And when I was in my 20s, I wrote these travel books, and they were full of history. From my mid-30s on, I was writing history that was full of travel. And one of my rules, I think, with writing history is that there should be nowhere important in the story.
Sorry, I lost you there.
There should be nowhere important in the story,
right,
that you haven't actually visited on foot.
Of course, yes, yeah.
Otherwise, you make huge errors. I mean, recently, for example, in the Anarchy, there was one of the great battles between the Marathas and the company at this point, led by the young Arthur Wellesley, later to go on to become the Duke of Wellington.
Assaye.
The Battle of Assaye. And I'd always read that the Battle of Assaye was very close to Ajanta. So I had a very clear image in my head of the Great Gorge of Ajanta and the incredibly sort of dramatic geography of that area. and assumed that assay was taking place in that sort of landscape. In fact, it turns out that assay is where, really the battle where the Marathas lost.
Sure.
Up to that point, it could have been quite possible for the Marathas to have taken over the whole of India and to become, without any reservations, the successors to the Mughals, which they were on the verge of doing.
Yeah.
And Assay was the battle in 1803 that really put paid to those dreams when the Maratha artillery for the first time was seen off by the Duke of Wellington. And it turned out that although it was very close to Ajanta, it's actually on a very flat plain. And that just in 5 miles, you move from that very dramatic landscape to a very flat one. And had I not visited it, I'd have written the description completely incorrectly. So travel is still an incredibly important part of. I mean, it's different if you're doing, academic, analytical history, concentrating on economic data and trade and so on. I think it's quite possible to write about the Mongol trade system without visiting Mongolia.
Sure.
With documents. But if you're writing narrative history where you're describing events that took place, you need to have a handle on the geography, on to see it. So and at the moment, planning my next book, which is on the diffusion of Indian ideas out in all directions in the early centuries, between about the 4th and the 7th century. So Buddhism going north to China and becoming the state religion of China. Hinduism going southeast and leading to Angkor Wat and the great Sanskritic civilizations of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And finally, Indian ideas of astronomy and mathematics going westwards to Baghdad and on to Renaissance Florence. In the decimal system and so on. Now, all these, I'm sitting here under lockdown, and the urge to, in any other circumstance, I'd been on the first plane to Borobudur or to any of these places I'm sitting reading about with huge pleasure.
Fantastic.
And I can't. So I'm going to have to just do all the research first and then have some spectacular trip when finally lockdown is lifted and go and see half the places.
And you're absolutely right, Willie. I found it incredibly important to travel during the penning of my first book, Surat, but also for the current book that I'm writing. I could never have written it if I hadn't, traveled to the places that I had kind of, marked out as destination places, not just purely in terms of academic study, because when I was visiting those places, I visited the libraries there, but also, as you rightly said, to get a sense of the history and geography. And what I realized is I actually landed up falling in love with the subject of geography. The mountains, the rivers, the lakes, the vistas as they open up, as you take a jeep and you drive through one country to another. And I think before I actually talk a little bit about my book,
we ought to hear where you've been.
Sorry?
We ought to hear where you've been, Moin.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me do it then, and then we'll come back, because I wanted to talk a bit also about 9 Lives, but we can come back to that. So this particular book of mine, Willie, is the story of a craftsman who is inclined towards the Sufi way of life. And
this is a novel, huh?
Yes, it's a historical novel, but the core reason for me to make this into a historical novel is because I realized, for me to tell the story of the Sufis, I tried to do it academically. I failed. It was too dry. And I very quickly, to put it succinctly, I realized the core of Sufism is love. And the only way you can show it is through characters who radiate that kind of love. Dare I say this, Nizami wrote Laila Majnu, which is a spiritual love story towards the end. Haft Aurang, which is written by Jami, is the story of Zulekha and Yusuf. But in the end, it is a spiritual love story. So
Joseph and Potiphar's wife in the Christian tradition.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. So I was inspired by the geometric patterns that are actually, that were propelled forward by a lot of Sufi craftsmen. And you can see them in the stone screens in Fatehpur Sikri, in the marble work at the mausoleum at Salim Chishti. And these geometric forms are what a scholar called Peter Wu, a South Korean scholar, called them the infinite designs of the Sufi mind. And based on that, I began my travels to understand these patterns and how Sufi craftsmanship brought them to life on stone screens, in marble, as well as in tile work. So you see the geometric patterns that have a similarity in principle of design all the way from Fatehpur Sikri right up till Al-Andalusia in Spain. So my first port of call was Fatehpur Sikri, and then I spent a couple of days there at the shrine of Hazrat Salim Chishti. From there I went to Humayun's tomb and studied the patterns there on the red sandstone, after which we left for Anatolia. And we had the most incredible journey because we landed up in Istanbul, and I was looking for these geometric tiles over there. I didn't actually find them in Istanbul, but I went into the Sultan Ahmet Mosque, and the tile work there absolutely stunned me.
Well, that Iznik tiles.
Iznik tiles, 20,000 of them, against the backdrop of 2,000 stained glass windows. And it was just astonishing. From there, I went to the Topkapi Palace, to the Baghdad Pavilion, specifically to look at the tile work of,
you should have gone to the Harem, the best tile work in Topkapi.
Yeah.
You should have let your nose follow you, boy.
I did go to the Harem. I did go to the Harem.
Was Leonie with you?
Sorry?
Was Leonie with you?
Very much, and keeping me in check all the time.
Very good.
Well, anyways, from there, after having taken in the beauty of the tile work in the Baghdad Pavilion, which really is quite special because it really talks about the paradise. They're called paradise tiles because they depict birds of paradise and an incredible array of orchards and all kinds of things. From there, we went to Konya, which is the mausoleum for Hazrat Jalaluddin Rumi. And I was amazed, Willie. I found the same geometric tile work on the shrines of the people who were attached to Rumi, and in the Alauddin Mosque, which is just about half a kilometer away from Rumi. And the geometry on those blue tiles is mesmerizing. It is just, you can't imagine how these people have put stars, hexagons, pentagons, all of them marrying into an infinite design. Anyways, I was just completely blown by that. And from there, we undertook a little road journey, which was actually quite haunting. We went through a pass on our way to Bursa. And that pass is called I've got it written down here because it was just astonishing. It's called just bear with me a second, guys, and I'll tell you. It's called the Sadi Kamit Pass. And it was in this pass the Sultan Dagi Pass. And it was in this pass that the Seljuk Sultan Kilik Arslan defeated in 1176 Manuel's army. And it is a very haunting
Manuel, the Byzantine emperor.
Yeah. And it's such a haunting pass. I mean, the guide was telling us all about how the shrill calls of the dead can still be heard, and it was nightmarish as we entered the ruined force of, and you can help me with this, Willie, I can't pronounce it correctly, it's called Myriakocephalum, and
I'll leave that one to you.
and it was a ruined fortress of Myriakocephalum where we actually broke journey. Anyways, from there we went to Bursa, and in Bursa I spent time there just understanding this brilliant geometric tile work again on the facade of
the first capital of the Ottomans before they captured Istanbul.
Yesil Kami Mosque. Inspired from that, I left for the Greek islands, one particular island called Patmos. And this was the island where allegedly the apocalypse has been written.
By John the Baptist, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry?
By John the Baptist.
By John the Baptist. And it was also alleged that some of Rumi's followers would go to the monastery right on the top and spend time meditating there, because the Greek Orthodox
There was,
priests.
there was a great deal of interaction often between Sufis and Christian mystics.
Precisely. And the Greek Orthodox mystics who led the burial of Rumi said of Rumi, he was bread and we were hungry men. How have you ever seen hungry men stay away from bread? So I had to go to Patmos and see this incredible monastery where John the Baptist wrote the Apocalypse, and it also is a confluence point, used to be a confluence point for Rumi dervishes to visit Christian monastery.
The great question is what St. John was on when he wrote the Apocalypse, because it's wacky stuff.
It is.
It
is
Rumi,
wacky
makes Rumi
stuff.
look very grounded and
yeah, it is wacky stuff. But listen, from there, Willie, I found my way into Al-Andalusia, southern Spain, chasing these geometry designs in the footstep of the Sufi craftsman. And I was astonished, because when I went to the Alhambra and you look at the tile work, which is just on the base of these balconies that open out into the Sierra Nevada, if you look very closely, there's a similarity of design between the tile work. It's not completely the same, but there's a similarity in pattern between that tile work and the geometric patterns on Humayun's tomb, on the redstone. There's
also there's actually been papers written on the similarity between some of the Alhambra calligraphy and the Alai Darwaza, the Qutb Mosque at the Kawat al-Islam Mosque in Meroli near here.
Exactly. But that's enlightening. I'd like to read that. And anyways, as I looked up to the roofs, the wooden roofs had these incredible geometric tile work as well, which are there in the Kunya Arc in Central Asia, in Kiva. So on the wooden arc on the wooden roof of the Khan's palace in Kiva in Central Asia,
which are fantastic explosions of color and geometry.
Yeah, you see the same patterns all the way in southern Spain. And so I was just completely mesmerized by that. And so my character in this current book is one who travels this particular route. And I was very fortunate to have the opportunities to make my way through this journey.
Were you taking detailed notes, Moin? Were you regarding it as work, or was it a jolly with Leonie? What was the?
Well, it was completely work, except for one bit where we honeymooned in Sicily.
In the middle of it.
So that is my book, but it was predominantly for the book, and it was predominantly to understand the link in the Sufi craftsmanship all the way from Fatehpur Sikri to Al-Andalusia in terms of geometric mastery, in stonework and in tile work.
Next time you're here in this part of the world, you must come to Dalrymple, where many of the families who cut the jalis of Fatehpur Sikri and of Humayun's tomb are still alive.
Fantastic.
When the Aga Khan Foundation, when they were restoring Humayun's tomb, they actually found direct lineages of the same guys who'd cut the original jalis. So they had great grandchildren of the original craftsmen doing it again and using the same techniques and of course unchanged technology.
It's astonishing, really. And the moment that I knew that this book had to be written is when, of course I had already written 4 chapters, but when I saw the jali work, the geometric work at Humayun's tomb, and I saw the similarity in southern Spain and in the roofs as well, and in the tile work, it was just amazing how these men, inspired by the love for the arts, were able to create something, and deeply drenched in spirituality, because it is called the design of the infinite. Because when you enmesh and mingle the stars and the hexagons and the pentagons, it's a repetitive form that gives you this illusion of never-ending infinity. Anyways, that's that's a little bit about my upcoming book and my
You're
travel.
going to have lots
Really,
of fun with that. Moin.
sorry.
You're going to have lots of fun with that. I think
I
it's
am.
really
I am. I'm enjoying it. But Willie, I want to come back to you and your books. Tell us a little bit about, if I may ask, how did you get writing City of Jinns? And tell us a little bit more about how you flung yourself into writing Nine Lives. These two, if you could just talk about them, that would be great.
cool. So very different in that they're very different books. With Xanadu or From the Mountain, which are both kind of narrative travel and be keeping a travel diary, just like you would do, you know, and you keep everything down. But the key thing is to get every detail, and so not just to be writing when you're exhausted in the evening, at the end of a day's travel, but to be like a journalist with a notebook in your hand all day, getting down the interesting conversations,
Sure.
getting down the essential, how your body reacts to a climate, the dirt between your feet, the sensation of sweat or heat or cold or whatever it is, so that you can actually you know, make the reader feel all the different senses. So not just sound, but smell, taste,
Sure.
touch. You know, and the more you can get down, the more you can. It doesn't have to be in good prose. It doesn't have to be beautifully written. But the more you can get the notes down, the more you can recreate it. Take
Sure.
photographs too. I mean, it all helps. And then with Jinns, it was obviously different because it was, you know, a diary of a not of a journey going from A to B, but of a year in a place. And so for the first time, I used a card index, which is something I've used throughout my career, but very useful particularly if you're writing topics and, for example, music or stories about jinns, or, you know, I would keep cards open, and when I heard a story at dinner or, well, you know, on a walk out in the old Delhi or whatever I was, I could just include it.
Sorry, Willie, but what were your reactions when you would hear stories about about jinns and the supernatural? You know, how did you initially react to that?
I think that the important thing with travel writing, and this is particularly the case with Nine Lives, is you know, it's very off-putting when you come across a travel writer who's very judgmental about what he's going through. And in a sense, that's why it's so difficult to read so many of the Victorians now, because they're
Sure.
huffing and puffing and you know, pushing their values onto everything that they come across, and judging
Sure.
it against their own culture. And it's much more interesting to me to read, you know, someone more open like Marco Polo, for example, who, you know, who is wide-eyed at everything he sees
Sure.
and records it without judgment. And I think when you're dealing with religion and superstition, things that other people believe in with great faith and profundity, in which, you know, you yourself from a different tradition may or may not believe in, that it's important just to record.
Sure.
That you and you lead it for the reader to make their. And this was particularly so with Nine Lives, which is, you know, deals with some quite tricky issues. The first story is the story of a Jain nun who is fasting to death. Now, most people from most traditions would regard that as suicide, and probably something rather reprehensible. But for Jains, it's a form of heroism,
Sure.
and a declaration of love, and religious duty. So, you know, to take a position on that seems to be off-putting and unnecessary. You record it as something strange that you've seen. You try and put faithfully how the Jains see it, and then you let the reader come to that conclusion. And I mean, another of the characters in Nine Lives is a Devdasi, a sacred prostitute.
Yes, that's a classic.
Now, how do you look on that?
Sure.
It's of no interest to anybody if you huff and puff like a Victorian missionary and say this is an immoral moral trade, and you know, take a moral stand. It's much more interesting for everybody if you just record it and try and empathize with the person's plight. In this case, she turned out to have AIDS.
Yeah.
And from which she would go on to die, and you know, and so it's a. I think one of the great arts of travel writing is to learn not to be judgmental, to leave your cultural baggage as much as possible behind, and to record.
Sure.
I mean, the story about the Devdasi was the first to be written. It was commissioned for a different project by the Bill Gates Foundation, who were doing a series of essays on people who had AIDS, and Rushdie, Kiran Desai, Suketu Mehta, a whole bunch of rather amazing writers were commissioned to write this, and I was sent off to do the Devdasis. And I realized when I finally worked out how to write it without coming to a value judgment, but just presenting it and not in the sense getting away, that I'd enjoyed that form of writing so much that I went on to do 8 others.
Sure.
And Nine Lives was, of all the books I've ever written, the quickest to write.
Really?
I did it.
But oddly enough, I would think probably one of the most trickiest subjects.
Yes, the difficulty was to know, in a sense, what you were looking for. I mean, you know, I would go, for example, the Sufi one. We were talking about Sufis earlier. The Red Fairy, this woman, this devotee in Sindh.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, at the shrine of Lal Shabazz Kalandar, or Julelal, as the Hindus who also go to the shrine call it. All I knew was I wanted to write about Sufism, and that was a shrine, because particularly I wanted the interaction in Pakistan between Hindus and Muslims.
Oh.
This is a Sufi shrine that until about 20 years ago had a lingam in the main shrine table, the most syncretic.
Amazing. A lingam in the shrine.
And in the main shrine chamber, in the tomb. And it's built on the site of one of the great centers of the Pashupatis, who were these early Shaivite ecstatics.
Yeah.
And the Damal, this drumming, this frenzied drumming ecstasy, which breaks out each evening, is supposed to be the relic of the Pashupatis' Damal drumming, the Shaivite drum.
Sure.
When you see pictures of the Natraj in his circle of flame, he has a drum in his hand.
Sure.
And the Pashupatis use this drumming to get themselves into ecstasy, and the Sufis have just taken it on.
Of course.
So it seemed to be a very interesting place to go, but I didn't know who I wanted to interview or what the story would be. And I just hung out in the shrine with a friend of mine who's a Sindhi translator. He came with me. And we sat together, and quite quickly we narrowed it down to this one extraordinary woman who was a refugee first from Bihar. She was a Muslim in Bihar who got driven out into Bangladesh, and then as a non-Bangla speaker, got thrown out of Bangladesh to Pakistan.
Wow!
So she was a double refugee, and having lost everything and had her family and everything had gone, she took shelter in the shrine of Julelal, of Lal Shabazz Kalandar. And it was a wonderful story, and you know when you found it.
It happened a bit with us as well, Willie, as we were passing through that godforsaken pass in Anatolia. We were on our way to Bursa, and someone pointed out, and they said, listen, you must visit this really small village, which is called Sayyid Ghazi. And Sayyid Ghazi is an incredible story. In 740 AD, as the Arab army was invading Anatolia, there was a general called Sayyid Battal. They called him Battal because he was incredibly tall, and Battal means giant. And while he's attacking this castle, this Greek castle in Anatolia, the general's daughter looks at him from the balcony, and he's just so stunningly good looking that she falls in love with him, and he falls in love with her.
It's none of your love stories. You keep coming across these love stories wherever you go.
Well, it's all about love, Willie. Anyway, they killed each other because they wanted the war to stop, and they're buried in a shrine together, which is called the Sayyid Ghazi Shrine. And it has this incredibly long tomb for Sayyid Ghazi, and this smaller tomb for this Greek princess and they both, you know, are buried together. But you encounter these incredible stories when you travel. But I'd like to ask you one thing, Willie. I know that, and I've been wanting to ask you this, and I know Return of the King was, you know, a book that was written about Afghanistan, and it was brilliantly, you know, just brilliantly timed with with all that was happening in that region. But in many ways, I also view it as, dare I say it, but also your travel experiences in that place. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, what was it like in Afghanistan back
Cool.
then?
So when I started with Return of a King, it was 2006, and it was still quite easy to get around Afghanistan. But very quickly, by the time I was finishing research in 2008, all sorts of places that had been possible to visit were closing down. The Taliban were circling in on Kabul, where they are now, and places like Kandahar, which I'd been able to visit earlier, became off limits, and Ghazni was already off limits. I had some quite hairy experiences. I'm never the kind of I'm not like Christina Lamb or one of these amazing war journalists, Marie Colvin, who, you know, when they hear a gun going off, they head towards it. I tend, like most people, to go in the opposite direction, away from. But inevitably, if you're traveling around Afghanistan, you often bump into it anyway. And I had a couple of quite hairy experiences. The main thing I wanted to do was to go and see the pass at Gundamuk, where the end of the famous retreat from Kabul, when the British Army, the East India Company Army, who have invaded Afghanistan and are defeated in battle, are given a safe passage back to what's now Pakistan. But of course, on the retreat, the Pathan circle, and the killing begins. And in what you know, in a sense, was the story that inspired the whole book. There's this famous moment when there's the last stand of the 51st on the hill at Gundamuk, and every last man is killed.
Yeah.
Other than Dr. Bryden, who escapes to tell everybody what's happened.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to see Gundamuk more than anything else, but it was already in Taliban hands. And luckily, I got in contact with the guy who, through President Karzai, who had read an earlier book of mine, the intelligence chief, and he's put me in touch with a tribal chieftain who just come in to the government from the Taliban.
Yeah.
A man called Jagdalik, who was a former Afghan wrestling champion. So you can imagine his physique.
He was a pehlwan.
He was a big guy. And anyway, we went off, and because he'd been with the rebels, he hadn't been to his home village. He'd been in hiding and on the run for a while. And so when he went to the village of Jagdalik on the way to Gundamuk, the whole village came out, a goat was slaughtered, a barbecue began, and the usual celebrations took place. And I was longing to get on and get to the next village, but I was a guest. I couldn't tell him to just drive me there.
Sure.
With all his men and all his followers and everything.
Yeah.
And by the end of the day, it became clear it was going to be too late to make it to Gundamuk, although we were very close. We were only about 7 or 8 miles away. And so we ended up going to Jalalabad and not seeing it. And that evening in Jalalabad, we heard that there'd been an incredible gun battle that day in Gundamuk. And had we gone there in the evening, I wouldn't be here now chatting to you on this call.
Oh, really? We wouldn't have let that happen.
No, well, it nearly did. And so we had and then there was another occasion when I finally got to Kandahar. And luckily, Rory Stewart's team had set me up with a security agency. There were some mercenaries basically living there, as there's no hotel open in Kandahar. I ended up living with
you, Willie, I'm sure.
Say it again?
Kids.
I was totally on my own at this point. And so I got picked up by these 2 rough, tough Scots ex-servicemen mercenaries who were living in this safe house on the edge of Kandahar under considerable guard. And the house was empty, but for sort of gym equipment, for them doing their weights. It was a very austere spot. Never trust Scotsmen if there is no bottle of whiskey around. It's a very bad sign. These were definitely teetotal mercenaries. Anyway, on the journey out of the airport in their armored car, these guys always travel around in armored Toyotas with bulletproof glass. When we got to their safe house, there was a sniper shot in the back window behind my head, and someone had taken a shot at us, a sniper shot, which hit exactly behind my head. But because it was luckily an armored car, I'm here to tell the tale. So I mean, none of these were deliberate acts of heroism or anything. They were just me rather miscalculating the danger in both cases.
And Willie, when you took up an assignment, so when you, as a historian, as a travel writer, when you do travel, I'm just trying to also keep it to our topic. Is there always a lurking sense of the unknown, or the lurking sense of danger, especially in regimes that, I'll tell you, I mean,
obviously slightly more in Afghanistan than in Andalusia or Patmos.
Way more.
I rather envy your Sybaritic travels.
But when you felt that, did you ever feel, gosh, I'm not going to pursue this anymore? Or,
well, I thought very much when my daughter was born, and I just come back from various trips in Afghanistan and Central Asia, and I very much felt that, my job now was to be a dad and not do this stuff, which is why I wrote White Moguls and Last Mogul, which the most dangerous thing in researching White Moguls was catching the central line from Shepherd's Bush into the British Library at Holborn.
Yeah,
it was. And those were very domesticated days. And then I suppose when the kids began to grow up, first 9 Lives, then Return of a King was, in a sense, my response to that. I was able to go and do some of the stuff I'd been missing, the more tricky stuff.
Excellent, Willie. This has been absolutely fantastic. Someone asked me, what am I reading currently? And you'll know this, Willie. Just bear with me a second. You'll know this quite well, I think. You'll know this fellow quite well, I think.
It's coming in back to front of me. An Ottoman Traveller.
By Evliya.
Evliya Çelebi.
Yes.
A wonderful writing.
Wonderful writing.
He's the guy who
he does go crazy at times, talking about Arabs screwing alligators and all of that. But, besides that, it's quite believable.
There's a lovely description he has of Jerusalem, where he calls it a golden bowl full of scorpions.
Yeah. And what are you reading, Willie? Someone's asking. What are you reading in travel?
So I'm deep in all this this next book. So I've been reading a lot of Buddhist stuff. For the whole story of the spread of Buddhism northwards from India and through the Kushan Empire, through Gandhara, into the Tarim Basin and so on. And I found one wonderful story, which is what I was reading last week, which is the story of, which is, I think, very well known to anyone that knows their Chinese history, which I don't, but the story of the first and only Empress of China, who ruled on her own as an empress, but not as a consort. And this was the Empress Wu Zetian. And she was the most incredible old bird. She was an imperial concubine who was, when the first emperor who she served, so to speak, died, she got put with the other concubines into a Buddhist nunnery, which was not a place that appealed to her for very long. And by this stage, she'd already seduced his son and got us
terrible seducer, really. Terrible seducer.
It's the next story. And she then had the next emperor poisoned and took over herself. Took a Buddhist monk as a lover, poisoned him. And in order to get rid of the Confucian hierarchy, who were opposed women running it, which is very against Confucian ideals to have a woman running the country, China to Buddhism. It becomes the state religion of China in order to sort of give her a legitimacy which she wouldn't have had in a Confucian state. And she and these sort of mysterious prophecies turn up, which say that she is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And she uses all this in a very ingenious way to become the supreme power in China. And so Buddhism becomes the religion of China through the machinations of this very unpious woman.
Wow.
It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story.
Really, for the book, you've been traveling extensively to China? Not now.
No, I mean, I've traveled extensively in China before, but haven't so far, because I mean, this is a new project. I've only really begun working it in lockdown, to be honest. I did one trip to Pakistan, to Gandhara, to go and see the museum in Peshawar and the Buddhist monasteries of Takti Bai and so on. Just before lockdown, and just got back 2 or 3 days before the lockdown took place. So,
wow, lucky you that you came in before all of that erupted. Willie, there's a question for you. Which year are we talking about? Your Chinese thing. Which year?
I'm not sure exactly what the parameters are. I mean, I think the focus is between about 300 and maybe 1200. But there's three different stories. There's the Buddhist story, which I suppose from the time of the Buddha, 300 BC, to its arrival as the state religion in China by 800. Then there's the story of Sanskrit, the Sanskritization of Southeast Asia, Sanskrit cosmopolis. And that's really at its peak between about 300 and 800, or 800 and 300 and 1100. And then the story of Hindu astronomy and mathematics going to Baghdad takes place in 800, and then it's picked up by Fibonacci, the Italian mathematician in Renaissance Florence in 1400. So those are the timescales.
Brilliant. Willie, there's a question for both you and me. The question is, what is the title of your next book? As far as I'm concerned, do not have a title as yet. Willie, what's the title of your book? And Willie, is there any evidence of Buddhism and its acceptance in Great Empire of Persia? 2 questions for you.
So first question, the title, it's going to be called, the working title is The Golden Road.
The Golden Road.
And the idea is that the Silk Road, which everyone makes such a fuss about, is actually a bit of a Western construction. The phrase was invented by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen only in the 1870s. And of course, at that period, everyone saw Europe as the center of the world. And therefore, China must have wanted to trade with Rome. And how did it trade? It traded on the Silk Road.
Yeah.
And of course, what everyone forgot was that the second economy of the world was not Rome, but India. Paliputra was 3 times the size of Rome, 5 times the size of Alexandria. And India was much richer than, so the main trade routes, and it wasn't overland, the main route of trade between Rome and the east was the sea route from the Red Sea to the west coast of India. There were 3 or 4 big ports. Barigaza in Sindh near Karachi was the one leading up to the Kushite Empire. Then Muziris in Kerala was the one in the south. And then the sea route on to China by the Malay Peninsula and the what's now Singapore. So so the story is really how is if you like the Indian Silk Road, the story of how Indian culture spreads out in the same way that Greek civilization spread first to Aegean Turkey and then all over the Mediterranean. So Indian culture, both in terms of Buddhism and in terms of Hinduism, Vaishnavism and Shaivism, and then and finally astronomy and mathematics, the decimal system, the Hindu numbering system, which moves from Brahmi to Arabic to finally acceptance in the West by the 12th and 13th century. All these stories.
And we have one question. We have one last question, Willie, maybe 1 or 2. Well, just second last one is probably for both of us, and it probably is from our last talk. how do you distance yourself from painful love stories?
You'd want to answer that first?
Okay, well, I think I have to be very fair. At least when I wrote the first book, as I mentioned in the last talk with Willie, is that, you know, there are times when you really can't distance yourself. You are in it. You know, the research is so deep, the story is so deep that you do fling yourself in it. And so it does take an immense amount of self-discipline to distance yourself from it and be objective. You got to keep telling yourself to be objective. But I have to admit, I don't completely distance myself from a painful love story, because then I probably wouldn't be able to write it, or I wouldn't be able to communicate it. Really?
I think also, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we're writers. We're after good stories, and so when a love story turns tragic, there is, you know, you're moved by it, but there's also a bit of you that knows that the reader's going to be moved by it, and you remain very excited by when you find these tragic stories. It's, you know, in a sense, it's the quarry that any hunter is after. So they always say that in every writer there's a little slither of ice in their hearts, as and that comes to the fore, I think, on these occasions.
Willie, have you been, a last question for you, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. Willie, have you been researching at the Khajuraho temples, specifically you?
Khajuraho, I went to quite recently, and it's towards the end of my time frame. It may make a minor appearance, but the main area that I'm going to be writing about, I think, in the story of Hinduization and Sanskritization of Southeast Asia, is going to be the East Coast Chola and Pallava ports, Mahabalipuram, Kanchipuram, and particularly I'm very excited by the character of Mahendra Pallava, who was the guy who probably commissioned Arjun's penance at Mahabalipuram, one of the great sculptures of India, and who also two plays of his survive, which are kind of Beckettian farces. He was very against Buddhism and very keen on his Shaivism. And he makes the kind of anti-hero of one of these plays, a Buddhist monk and the play is rather like Waiting for Godot. It's just got two characters. It's got a Buddhist monk and a prostitute meeting in a bar. It's fantastic. You have so here is the place where all the communication with Southeast Asia is coming out of, and a lot of the sculptures in Southeast Asia are based on Pallava sculptures and so on. And it turns out we've got two full-length plays surviving from the guy who made the main sculpture on the main port. So you could, and then one of his main littérateurs in the court is Danda, the Sanskrit writer, who wrote on Rasa theory. So it's all beginning to build up. I mean, it's very early days yet, but it's like it's all coming together very nicely. It's coagulating into a good old story.
Fantastic. Willie, thank you so much. And thank you, viewers and listeners, so much for your time and generosity. Willie has been so kind to take time out.
It's much fun. My one social event of the week.
Yeah, but it's been great fun. And thank you so much for supporting us. Really humbled I am for all your support and your questions. And Willie, once again, thank you so much. Thanks, Roli.
Thank you, boy. Thank you.
And all the best. Stay safe.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.